Start off, Stan. We're ready to go.
All right. Thanks again, all of you in Wyoming and Colorado for joining this call. I'm going to run through 20 or so minutes on the Arctic Refuge, some background and some of the connections between the refuge and folks all across the country, and then Eric will pick it up on the political situation. So before we launch into it, I'll just say that the Arctic Refuge is one of the great iconic landscapes in American conservation, and in many ways it ranks with those names like Yellowstone and the Everglades, the Redwoods, the Grand Canyon, and your own Rocky Mountain National Park. These are places that are really central to conservation in the American landscape. So next slide. Dolly, next slide. There we go. So just to start, for decades, the refuge has been the subject of controversy because there is the likelihood that there's some oil underneath its coastal plain. And make no mistake, this is not an issue or a place where there's middle ground. It's either going to be oil or it's going to be wilderness. And that's really what I want to talk about in the balance of this talk. Next. The refuge was first established in 1960 during the Eisenhower administration. It's a little over 19 million acres in size, and so that makes it, I think, about 30% maybe of the size of Colorado, if my arithmetic is right, in northeast Alaska. And maybe some of you have even been there, but this map at least allows you to place it in the universe here. So next. What I want to do is introduce you briefly to the ecosystem. And so if we look on the south side of the refuge, on the south side of the Brooks Range Mountains, which are the northern extent of the Rockies that are coming up through Colorado and Wyoming. What we see here is the last of the boreal forest that spans the whole continent from Alaska to the maritime provinces in Canada. So this is the south side of the Brooks Range. Next. Then as you travel north through the refuge, you get up into the heart of the Brooks Range, and this is the very highest parts, very highest peaks of the Brooks Range in Alaska, roughly at around 9,000 feet. Next. As you travel over those high mountains and you see them in the background there with the snow-covered peaks, you have a handful of passes and that turn into river valleys that then are running north to the Arctic Ocean. And these river valleys become corridors of access for people as well as wildlife traversing the refuge. Next. Once the rivers running out of the Brooks Range break through the foothills of the Brooks Range, they cross a coastal plain, which is tundra, and all of those little dots you're seeing on the map in the sort of the left half, those are all caribou out on the coastal plain. This would be ground zero for oil development if it were to happen in the Arctic Refuge. Next. And then lastly, the refuge ends in a series of wetlands and lagoons inside barrier islands fronting the Arctic Ocean. So we have a span from that boreal forest on the south side of the refuge, the Yukon River drainage going north over the mountains, across the coastal plain, and out to the Arctic Ocean. Next. One of the things we like to say about the refuge is that it's a complete and intact ecosystem. And one of the ways we know that is because it still has a full complement of its native wildlife, particularly its large mammals. Here's a polar bear, and you can see briefly on the map that orange area are the on-land denning areas that are so important now to polar bears as the Arctic pack ice gets more and more uncertain. So the Arctic refuge is very important to polar bear habitat, and this really is an apex predator if there ever was one. I can tell you that if you're out on the landscape and you see a polar bear in the distance and you have nowhere to go, it elevates your heartbeat rather quickly. Next. Not going to run through all of the wildlife in the refuge, but to pick a few, we have musk oxen, which are really throwbacks to the days of the Pleistocene era. And this is the one wildlife species that had to be reestablished in the refuge as its original population was extirpated in the late 1800s. So in about circa 1970, this one was reintroduced. Otherwise, all the wildlife in the refuge have been from the original stock. Next one. And in the high mountains, we have Dall sheep, the white sheep, equivalent to, of course, to the Rocky Mountain sheep that you're more familiar with. Next. The star of the show, probably from a wildlife standpoint, are the caribou. This is the coastal plain, Brooks Range again in the background. My former colleague and our senior scientist at Audubon, Alaska for many years, took this photo when he was flying aerial surveys for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and on the day that this photo was taken, they counted 90,000 caribou on the coastal plain in one day of surveys. Next. The caribou come to the coastal plain to have their calves. There is some highly nutritious forage there. There tend to be fewer predators out on that coastal plain, and because it's a wide open expanse where the wind is always blowing, there tend to be fewer insects than there would be in more sheltered locations. So this is the calving ground of what we call the porcupine caribou herd, named after the Porcupine River in Canada. Next. You can see here, this is the range of the primary habitat and range of the porcupine herd. That bright red up in the sort of left center at the top, that is the coastal plain of the refuge. Those brown lines show their annual migration, so they have their calves up in the north. They come down through passes in the Brooks Range. They spend the winter in the boreal forest down to the south. You can see around the community of Eagle and Circle and Fort Yukon. Then they migrate back north up through the Canadian side and either have their calves up in the area of that Arctic National Park or on the Alaskan side in the Arctic Refuge. These caribou, there are about 200,000 of them now, travel about 1,000 miles as the raven flies in their migration, but an individual caribou may wander actually as much as 3,000 miles when you count all the coming and going and moving around as they feed and escape predators and so on. The other message with this slide is that range of the caribou herd also describes the homeland of the Gwich'in, who are Athabascan people who have lived on this land for millennia, and they really are the people of the caribou, and caribou are at the center of their very culture as well as subsistence harvest today, and they consider the calving ground of this porcupine caribou herd to be sacred ground. Next. Of course, we're Audubon, and we want to talk about the birds. And there's extraordinary bird life in the refuge. About 200 species use the area, and some of them are, like this Arctic tern, are well-known global travelers. Next. We're not going to get too far into the weeds on this image, but it just shows all of the connections of the birds literally around the world. They travel, birds that use the Arctic Refuge travel to all continents but Europe and as far away as the waters off Antarctica, which is where many of those Arctic terns end up. And if you'll see on the left, birds like the northern wheatear going to sub-Saharan Africa. On the right, birds like the American golden plover going to the pampas of Argentina and everywhere in between. Next. I picked a couple examples that relate to Colorado and Wyoming. This may, that red star on the map keeps moving on me. That's supposed to be in Denali National Park in the middle of Alaska. That's interesting that keeps moving. One of the things that telemetry studies have shown us is that the golden eagles that nest in Denali National Park in the middle of Alaska, those subadult birds will winter in that winter range that you're seeing here, including much of Colorado and Wyoming, and then they go spend the summers up in the places like the Arctic Refuge and elsewhere on the North Slope of Alaska. And they do that for several seasons, and then when they're fully mature, they go back to Denali National Park to find their own mates and nests. So a nice connection there between Denali, between Colorado, Wyoming, and then the Arctic Refuge. Next. Another example are Lapland longspurs, and some of you who perhaps do Christmas bird counts in eastern Colorado or eastern Wyoming out on the prairies, you know the large flocks of longspurs that may include Lapland longspurs, which easily could have nested in the Arctic Refuge. Next. And some of the more distant birds, I'll just mention one here, the whimbrel, which nests on that coastal plain. And they may end up spending the winter down in southern Chile at a place called Chiloé Island, which is one of the places where Audubon is working to protect winter habitat for whimbrel and also Hudsonian godwits that nest in Alaska. So not only do the birds of the Arctic Refuge travel to all of these places, they're actually traveling to places where Audubon is actively working to protect habitats throughout their annual cycle. Next. So I've mentioned that the refuge has an intact ecosystem. It has its large mammals and other mammals still present. It has an amazing array of bird life that touches all the parts of the world, really. and the last thing it has is wilderness. And I like to think that when those birds travel to the far corners of the globe, they're carrying a little bit of Arctic wilderness with them. And for me, it is the wilderness that is actually the most precious and vulnerable asset that the Arctic Refuge has to offer. Just an extraordinary place where, except for the small coastal village of Kaktovik up on the Beaufort Sea, really man is a visitor in the Arctic Refuge, and I hope it will always stay that way. Next. Not going to spend a lot of time here, but here's the nub of the controversy. I mentioned before that the refuge was first established in 1960 during the Eisenhower administration, and then in 1980, when President Jimmy Carter signed the Alaska Lands Act, the refuge was expanded, and much of it was designated wilderness with a capital W. You can see the area there through the sort of the right center where it says wilderness area. That's the Molly Beatty Wilderness Area. But note that above there, yeah, thank you, Dolly. Note that above there is what we call the 1002 area. 1002 is not a very glamorous name, but it refers to a section of the section 1002 of the Alaska Lands Act, and that is not a part of the designated wilderness. And here's why. And I was there at the time. I was working for the Wilderness Society at that point, and we on the conservation side, frankly, we didn't have the votes in the U.S. Senate to get that designated as wilderness because of its potential for oil. And the other side, the ones who wanted to drill there, didn't have the votes to open it for oil drilling. And so when the Alaska Lands Act was passed in 1980, basically Congress punted, said, well, someone down the road is going to deal with whether or not this area is open for wilderness. So that's a 1.5 million acre area, that 1002 area, underlying the coastal plain where there is some oil potential. And that's really what the argument has been all about. Next. There was a rush for oil in Alaska's North Slope going back to 1968 when ARCO first discovered oil at Prudhoe Bay, and the Alaskan Arctic has never been the same since. Next. Since 1980, when that act was passed, there have been multiple attempts to open the refuge for drilling. The subject of whether or not to drill has crept into debates at both the presidential level and the vice presidential level. Here on the right, you can see Al Gore and George W. Bush, and that was one of the debates where this came up. So it's been a long-running debate. And we have come perilously close on several occasions to having the refuge opened. Next. In one of those cases in 1989, we really had no recourse. Congress had voted to open the refuge. We had a president who was prepared to sign legislation that would have opened the refuge, and along came the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Prince William Sound, dumping 10 million gallons of oil from Alaska's North Slope into Prince William Sound and the Gulf of Alaska. And even the pro oil drilling folks didn't have the stomach to go ahead with drilling in the Arctic Refuge after that event. So that one saved our skin there. Next. One of the ironies here, just two images briefly. You can see on the left, there's a thin cream-colored area between the red and the blue. and that is the estimated contribution of drilling in the Arctic Refuge to relative to, in this case, imports and estimated domestic supplies in red. And then on the right, you can see that our own domestic supplies are in 2017 are actually increasing dramatically. So the take-home message from these two images is that the anticipated contribution of oil were the refuge to be drilled is very small relative to the nation's other supplies and consumption. And we're in a time of increasing supplies. So there seems little rationale, even from an economic and energy security standpoint, of going into the refuge. Next. If you look on the right, you can see the 1002 area in that gray, and the point of this slide is simply to show you that all that pink and yellow are areas of active oil and gas leasing or activity. And so much of the Central Arctic is committed to oil and gas development. In the National Petroleum Reserve, there on the left, there's oil development, even while Audubon has worked hard and successfully so far to keep some of the special places like around Teshekpuk Lake, that big lake in blue, to keep that free of oil development. The Arctic Refuge on the right is our last chance to have a full intact Arctic ecosystem with no oil and gas activity in it. Next. As it is, the sprawl of oil development at Prudhoe Bay and all the satellite fields that have developed, there are now 1,000 square miles of the North Slope of Alaska that bear some infrastructure from the oil industry on it. Next. The industry's footprint has gotten smaller, and this is to their credit. This is a site called Alpine. It's a ConocoPhillips facility. The whole area on that big gravel pad that you see is less than 100 acres. I've been out there. It's really quite impressive as a matter of industry, but the inevitable connection is that everything has to have pipelines. There will be roads connecting many of the nodes in these places. There are all of the aircraft flights and everything that go with oil development. No matter how small they can reduce the footprint, you've got to have the pipelines, the roads, and the airstrips, and all the other ways that allow them to access these places. Next. One of the myths that contained in legislation that is before Congress now that would open the area for drilling is that somehow if the Arctic Refuge coastal plain were drilled, it would be confined to 2,000 acres. What they're not telling you is that that means just 2,000 acres covered by gravel pads. But those 2,000 acres, in fact, could be scattered across the whole coastal plain, as is shown here in a hypothetical image of what that oil development would look like. So it would not be 2,000 acres in one compact area, but it would be 2,000 acres covering or scattered across that whole coastal plain, and again connected with roads, pipelines, and everything else, dormitories, gravel borrow sites, refuse disposal, communications towers, everything that goes with an industrial oil field. Next. So the decision really comes down for the Arctic Refuge of, is it going to be wild or is it going to be an oil field? Next. Briefly, some of the impacts, a lot of concern about caribou. It's something of a mixed bag because caribou do have a certain ability to tolerate some disturbance. But what we know is that pregnant cows and cows with calves avoid human activity and facilities, and no one yet has put an industrial scale oil field in the middle of a calving ground of a 200,000 animal caribou herd, and that's an experiment we do not want to conduct. Next. We also know that breeding birds like this American golden plover become vulnerable to all the predators, foxes, ravens, wolves, grizzly bears, everything else that tends to be attracted by development ends up increasing predation levels on birds like golden plovers and others. Next. I mentioned before that the caribou are essential to the Gwich'in culture, and you know, they continue to use caribou for their primary source of protein, and you can see here a quote from the late Jonathan Solomon that the future of the Gwich'in and the future of the caribou are the same. Next. The Arctic Refuge is a laboratory that's presently free of direct industrial influence, but it is also a place where we can measure the effects of a changing climate in an Arctic landscape. And this is a spot, and I've been there to the west of the Arctic Refuge, where you now are seeing chunks of what used to be frozen tundra, permafrost, falling off into the sea. These are the size of houses dropping off into the sea because there are now waves beating this coast at a place where there didn't used to be waves because the ocean was covered by ice much of the year. Next. The Arctic Refuge is an incredible place for wilderness recreation. That's something that's not compatible with oil development. And then next. And I mentioned before that the wilderness itself is really what is at stake here. And that goes beyond just recreation. You know, frankly, most of us in our lives don't have the time or the money to travel distances for, you know, a float trip in a place like the Arctic Refuge. But what I've found across the country is that it's so important for people simply to know that these wild areas exist. It's important for us psychologically, spiritually, whatever terms you want to put it in. And knowing that there's big blank spaces on the map is critical. And there is no such thing as a wilderness oil field. It's either one or the other. Next. So that's the decision we have to make, wilderness or an oil field. Next. And we do it for the birds, and we do it for ourselves, and we do it for our children. And with that, I think the next image is Eric Schneider's, and he'll talk about the politics. Thank you all.
Great. Hope everyone can hear me all right. Again, my name is Eric Schneider. I'm a policy associate at the National Audubon Society in the Washington, D.C. office. So as Stan said, I'm going to dive into the political context, talk a little bit about the current threat and what you can do about it. So Stan laid out, the Arctic Refuge is a place that we have to protect. It is critical for birds, wildlife, for recreation, subsistence, and so much more. And unfortunately, the threat now to the Arctic Refuge is at one of its highest levels ever. We have been here before and have won before and will win again, but it will be a big fight. And so we need all of Audubon supporters to help as much as they can to be able to push back against efforts to open up the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge to oil drilling. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about why the refuge is at risk now. And the reasons may not be too surprising, but the primary reason now is the change in the political context. So, the past number of years we've had a backstop with the administration, and we do not have that anymore. So in previous Congresses, this is an image going back to the 90s, we've had many efforts in Congress to try to open up the coastal plain of the 1002 area, as Stan said, to drilling, and there's been vetoes by previous administrations. In the past 8 years, there was an administration that supported protecting the Arctic Refuge, and although there were pieces of legislation introduced in Congress, they weren't able to move, and there was recognition that those would have been blocked by the administration. So now we have an administration, unfortunately, that is aggressively trying to expand oil and gas development on public lands and waters, and we're starting to see that play out. So there's a real risk due to both the administration, a strong Alaska delegation. The senators from Alaska and the representative are strong supporters of opening up the refuge to oil and gas development, and there's a lot of support in Congress as well. So we've got to continue to build support for protecting it. So the primary threat we are seeing now in Washington surrounding the Arctic Refuge is through the budget process. So I'm just going to walk through a little bit about why. Try not to get too wonky with it, but this is where we're focusing our efforts now, and we need members of Congress to pay attention to this threat. So the budget process begins with the President's budget request. So that comes out earlier in the year. And that's a request to Congress. It's not a binding document, but it asks for certain funding levels. And then the House and Senate put out their own versions. Those are called the budget resolutions. Those are key to this whole process because this process has begun now, and the House has put out a resolution that would allow for opening up the Arctic Refuge to oil development. And that's through something called reconciliation. Sorry to throw all these terms out at you, but this is the name of the term that allows basically getting around a filibuster in the Senate. So normally a bill can be blocked in the Senate with only 40 senators, 41, and this allows them to get around that process. And so this is the biggest concern because the votes would be very close if it came down to it. So the House has now put out a document that includes language that would open up the refuge, and we're now waiting out for the Senate. So the House will be acting on this process likely this month, and then the two houses would get together, and then that's when the House and Senate would go back to voting on the floor. So there's a number of steps in the process, but the main thing to know is that the most sort of efficient way for the refuge to be open to oil development is through the budget. So we want to make sure that congressmen from Colorado and Wyoming are aware that this effort is underway, that it's a serious threat to the refuge, and that they should oppose it. So this is just to show that this is a page that was in the administration's budget request, the president's budget request, and so this was the first step in the process. So it didn't get off to a great start, fortunately for the refuge. And the Trump administration called for a leasing program for oil and gas in the Arctic refuge, and as a way to raise revenue. And so that's the connection to the budget, and that they're attempting to raise federal revenue by leasing for oil and gas on the coastal plain. So I wanted to just take a minute and talk about the current context within Colorado and Wyoming. Colorado particularly is an important state because of some of the elected officials there. So starting at the top with the Senate, Senator Michael Bennet, he is a champion for the Arctic Refuge. That's what champ means there. He's was one of the original co-sponsors of the bill to try to permanently protect the Arctic Refuge through a wilderness designation. So he's one of the leaders really in Congress now calling for support. So he's somebody that should be thanked for his leadership, and that will help him, continue to make this a top priority for him when he's hearing from his constituents that this is important to them and to his voters. So Senator Cory Gardner, the other senator, is very important as well because he's a top target for Audubon and for other conservation organizations, because he's someone who has in some ways supported public lands. He has not been as supportive on all the issues, and so he's someone that is a focus for continuing to push hard and asking him to support public lands, and the Arctic Refuge is one of them. And so we're making the Arctic Refuge one of the sort of a symbol of public lands and wilderness, and it's important for him to be hearing that. The Wyoming senator is a little more challenging, but Senator Barrasso is the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee. So it's very important for him to be hearing from his constituents as well that the Arctic Refuge mattered to his constituents. And then in the House, we have a few Colorado representatives who have supported the bill to protect the Arctic Refuge, and so that's what CHAMP means there in blue. So those also are important. If you happen to have those members as your own representative, to let them know that you appreciate their leadership on the Arctic Refuge. And then there's also a target in Colorado, Congressman Mike Kaufman, who lives in represents a swing district, so someone who may be more likely to be swayed by hearing from his constituents that they care about this issue. And this is just a slide to show that one of the strategies we're working on, speaking of Congressman Kaufman, is that we're trying to build up support from moderate Republicans in the House to call on the House to protect the refuge and avoid using the budget process. So that's something that you can tell your own members of Congress about, to ask leadership in the House of Representatives to oppose this process. And these are the two bills. So you're aware, H.R. 1889 in the House and S. 820 in the Senate, as reference to tell your own congressmen and senators about. These are the bills that would permanently protect the refuge as wilderness. And then just to cover a few things about what you can do. These are kind of the standard steps to reaching out to Congress. One, of course, having meetings with your congressman. They can be public events. They could be private meetings that you can help set up, as well as emailing or calling. We have an action alert on our page on audubon.org where you can send a letter that's already set up and just need to fill in your name and address, or you can personalize that letter as well, and that always makes a difference by sending your own personal letter. Or you can call their office. If you know you're a member of Congress, you can just do a quick call to their office and ask them to support the Arctic Refuge. It doesn't have to be long or complicated. Just saying that makes a big difference. And then writing a letter to the editor, showing that there's support out in the public is an important piece as well. And then if you're involved with the chapter, an Audubon chapter, that can be very helpful as well. And so again, the ask is really protecting the Arctic Refuge and opposing opening the refuge as part of the budget. So I'm happy to provide you with more information if you're looking for more info. There's my email there. We have lots of materials as well. If you'd like some, just to show you real quick on the next slide, that we have fact sheets available that are specific to Colorado, and glad to provide that to you and anything else that you think would be helpful if you'd like to get involved and engaged on protecting the Arctic Refuge. And that's all I have, and I'll turn it over back to Dolly.
Thank you, Stan and Eric. Really appreciate you giving that presentation. I just want to let everybody know that I have now unmuted all the lines, and I will also be following up with this fact sheet that you see on your screen, as well as Eric's contact information and mine. Folks are always welcome to reach out to me. We'd love to be able to make sure that our members of Congress know, whether you're in Colorado or in Wyoming, that the birds that we see here do come, many of them are breeding in the Arctic Refuge there along the coastal plains, and so it is important to us in making sure that they hear from their constituents. So now I have taken you off of mute. Are there any questions for either Stan or Eric, maybe on the history of the refuge, what's going on there, or any questions on the politics in DC? And if I'd actually like to start the question. This question is for both Stan and Eric. Curious as to the motivations, from what I understand, and from what you shared with us today, that the delegation out of Alaska is really pushing this. Curious as to the motivations behind that. And then if you could answer that, and I'll have a follow-up question after that.
All right, this is Stan. I'll say two things. One is that the state of Alaska, their state government is almost wholly dependent on revenue from oil and gas drilling to fund state government. And the existing Prudhoe Bay oil fields, although new, satellite fields are coming online, the existing Prudhoe Bay fields are largely spent. And so between low oil prices and a declining production from the core of Prudhoe Bay, they're looking for new opportunities to basically fund state government. So there's that. The second part is that the oil industry, by and large, particularly the big guys, ConocoPhillips, BP, Exxon, Shell, do not seem particularly motivated to get into the Arctic Refuge. But I think it's become a litmus test for politicians in Alaska that you have to support drilling in the Arctic Refuge. The state needs money, and they're operating under the assumption that if you open the refuge for drilling, someone will want to drill there. Sort of build it and they will come.
Thank you, Stan. Anything to add to that, Eric?
I think that covers it.
Great. So my follow-up question is looking at, we have folks here on the call from Wyoming and Colorado. Both of our states have long histories of oil and gas development and renewable energy development more recently. And so I think our folks understand the importance of oil and gas development to economies. Curious kind of with that and the knowledge that you both have working with reaching out to elected officials, what kind of messaging might work when constituents are talking to their members of Congress, specifically about this?
I think, again, Stan here, I think my message is that there's some places that are simply too special to be drilled for oil or gas, and that you know, we are in an age where the end of our dependence on fossil fuels, I think, is in sight, or it should be in sight. But clearly, the nation is not out of the oil and gas business yet, and it's going to be a while before it will be. And so this isn't a blanket opposition to oil and gas activity, but some places are simply too special to be drilled, and the Arctic Refuge is one of those places we should stay out of.
Thank you, Stan. Eric?
Yeah, I would just echo that and say, you know, you don't have to be opposed to, you know, all oil development to say that we shouldn't be drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This is a place that was set up as a safe haven for birds, for caribou, for other wildlife. There are places set up specifically for oil development, and there's, as Stan said, been a major increase in oil development in the United States and in Alaska. There's been major finds in Alaska outside of the Arctic Refuge. So it's not only is it too special, it's just not necessary to drill in this place.
Great, thank you. And I know we're nearing the top of the hour, but just wanted to again open the floor up if anyone else on the phone has any questions for either Stan or Eric. Again, all lines have been unmuted. All right. Well, it sounds like Stan and Eric, you guys did a fantastic job of getting this information. And I will be following up with folks. I have had some questions in the chat box, including, you know, can we get access to this presentation and what other kind of fact sheets and follow-up materials are available. I will be following up with everybody after this, and we'll see, hopefully the recording works well. If you have a pad and pencil, pad and paper there, my phone number here is 970-416-6931 in case you have an issue getting an email from me, but I will be doing a follow-up in the next couple of days with more information. So thank you again to everybody for taking time out of their lunch hour. We'll get you information so that you could share this with friends and family, and again, let our elected officials know that the Arctic Refuge is important to us here in Wyoming and Colorado. Thank you, Stan and Eric, so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great job. Thanks.